The ashes of the First World War did not bring peace but seeds of hatred. In a continent ruined by misery, dictators arose who turned resentment into a weapon and ambition into destiny. From Versailles to Munich, from the streets of Berlin to the skies of Nanking, the world slid, step by step, toward an inevitable abyss. This is the full story of how the Second World War began. A journey from 1918 to 1939, told in pure color, where each decision, each pact and each silence pushed us toward humanity's greatest tragedy. From defeat to Nazism, the wounds of the Treaty of Versailles, Europe, 1919. The bells that had announced the end of the Great War still echoed in the devastated towns and cities, but not as an echo of hope, rather as a reminder of an impossible sacrifice to forget. The soldiers returned with mutilated bodies and lost gazes. Cemeteries grew like open wounds in every village. Widows waited for letters that would never arrive. In the midst of that devastated landscape, the victors sought to build a new order that would guarantee peace. They did so in Versailles, in the very palace that had seen the kings of France and the birth of the German Empire. They chose a stage charged with symbols, but what was signed there was not a pact of reconciliation, but a condemnation, the Treaty of Versailles. On the 28th of June of 1919, the Hall of Mirrors became the setting of a solemn and cruel play. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, with the shine of the mirrors multiplying the gold-embroidered uniforms, the Allied delegates sat as judges in a tribunal that pronounced sentence. Outside, crowds waited. For France, it was the day of justice, revenge for Alsace and Lorraine, the confirmation that the bloodshed had not been in vain. For the Germans, on the other hand, the scene was a calvary. They had been invited to listen, not to negotiate. The German representatives received the text and scanned it with incredulous eyes. One of them, with clenched lips, murmured, "This is not a treaty. It is a death sentence." And it was, at least in the spirit of a people who felt outraged. The conditions were relentless. The German army was reduced to 100,000 men, without tanks, without military aircraft, without submarines. They were stripped of territories that had been symbols of pride. Alsace and Lorraine returned to France. The Polish corridor opened a wound that separated East Prussia from the rest of the country. Danzig, a city German by culture and language, became an enclave under international control. The colonies in Africa and Asia were divided as spoils among the British and the French. And above all, the most humiliating clause, Article 231, which declared Germany as the sole culprit of the war, forcing it to pay excessive reparations, a sum conceived not to be paid but to crush any possibility of recovery. The news fell upon the people like a storm. In the streets of Berlin, Munich and Hamburg, men and women read the terms of the diktat with eyes wide open in fury. In beer halls, among clouds of smoke and glasses of cheap beer, veterans pounded the tables. They had not been defeated on their own soil. Their flags still waved in enemy territories in 1918. For them, the war had been lost in the offices, not in the trenches. From that conviction was born the myth of the stab in the back. The idea that cowardly and traitorous politicians had surrendered what the army had defended. That myth would become a poison that seeped into the blood of an entire generation. At the same time, everyday life became unbearable. Germany remained under Allied blockade with shortages of food and coal. The winter of 1919 would be remembered as the turnip winter because millions survived on that hard and bitter tuber, boiled again and again. Children's eyes were sunken, and mothers walked kilometers in search of bread. Inflation began to devour the country. Bills that once sufficed to buy bread barely reached for a meager loaf, and soon would not even serve to light the stove. Families kept bundles of worthless paper money, while despair spread like a shadow. The ex-combatants, who had left as heroes, returned to cities where there was neither employment nor dignity. They marched in silent columns, still in their worn uniforms, medals on their chests and emptiness in their eyes. The newly born Weimar Republic had to administer an impossible defeat amid coups d'etat, failed revolutions, and armed uprisings that pitted communists and nationalists against each other in the streets. It was a weak republic, surrounded by enemies and betrayals, hated by the left and by the right, and associated from the beginning with the humiliation of Versailles. In this climate of hunger, resentment, and disillusionment, the storm was incubated. The young people who had seen the empire collapse swore that someday they would restore lost greatness. The veterans, unable to adapt to civilian life, grouped themselves into paramilitary corps that roamed the streets in brown or black shirts, accustomed to violence as a way of life. The incendiary speeches found echo in auditoriums full of people seeking easy explanations for such a complex disaster: the internal enemies, the Jews, the communists, the traitorous politicians. All that accumulated hatred fed on a single symbol, repeated in every pamphlet, in every poster, in every conversation: Versailles. The treaty, which had been born as a promise of peace, became the founding act of the next war. It did not solve problems, it multiplied them. It did not close wounds, it opened them deeper. Upon those ruins of dignity and hope would rise years later the voice of an agitator who promised to break the chains of 1919. And millions, remembering the humiliation of Versailles, would be willing to listen to him. Hitler's cultivation, economic and political crises between the wars, Europe, the 1920s. The smoke of the Great War still floated in the air when Germany tried to walk upon the ruins of its empire. The Weimar Republic, born between defeat and chaos, appeared as a fragile experiment, a government that intended to be democratic in a nation that scarcely knew democracy. From its first days, it was a besieged republic by the revolutionary left, by the reactionary right, and by the very memory of the humiliation of Versailles. In 1920, the first sign that nothing would be simple exploded in the streets: the Kapp Putsch. Troops of former combatants, the feared Freikorps, marched on Berlin with frayed uniforms and rifles in hand, convinced that they could overthrow the government that had signed the surrender. For a few days, the capital sank into confusion. The government fled, the coup plotters occupied buildings, and only a general strike, one of the greatest in German history, managed to paralyze the country and return power to the authorities. The message was clear. The Republic had no solid foundations. It survived by improvisation and fear. Shortly after, revolutionary uprisings of communist inspiration set the Ruhr and Saxony ablaze. In factories and mines, red flags were raised, and workers shouted slogans from Moscow. The Republic responded with violence, sending those same Freikorps that had shortly before tried to overthrow it. The clashes left thousands dead. Germany seemed condemned to live between extremes, neither peace nor reconciliation, only bloody adjustments on a balance that never stabilized. But the worst was yet to come: the economic catastrophe. As the reparations demanded by Versailles accumulated, the state's coffers emptied. The German government began to print money to cover impossible debts, and what at first seemed a quick solution soon became an unbridled monster. In 1923, hyperinflation reached unimaginable dimensions. The German mark became worthless paper. A kilogram of bread, which in 1919 had cost a few pennies, came to cost thousands of millions. Entire families dragged wheelbarrows full of bills to buy food. Children played with bundles of money as if they were building blocks. Housewives lit stoves with banknotes because it was cheaper than buying coal. Money had ceased to be money, and with it evaporated confidence in the Republic. The occupation of the Ruhr by French and Belgian troops in reprisal for the non-payment of debts was an even deeper wound. Foreign soldiers patrolled the streets of German industrial cities, confiscated coal and steel, and forced workers to labor under their watch. The Weimar government called for passive resistance, strikes, sabotage, paralysis. But that resistance sank the economy even further. Meanwhile, in taverns and cafes, nationalist speeches inflamed tempers. They take our bread, they take our work, they take our dignity. Until when? The words penetrated a population that felt it lived under permanent occupation. It was in that poisoned climate that figures who would later be decisive began to stand out. In 1923, a hoarse-voiced agitator with theatrical gestures attempted his first coup: Adolf Hitler. Along with veterans such as Ludendorff, he tried to imitate Mussolini's march on Rome with an uprising in Munich, the famous beer hall putsch. The attempt failed, but it left powerful images. Columns of men with armbands and banners, shootings in the streets, and a future dictator handcuffed but smiling before the cameras. His brief stay in prison gave him something more valuable than immediate power: time to write Mein Kampf and project himself as the prophet of a reborn Germany. Meanwhile, the people tried to survive as they could. Daily life was a swing between despair and adaptation. Housewives invented recipes with what little there was. Merchants exchanged goods through barter. Artists responded with provocation. Berlin became a city of contrasts, cabarets that exploited decadence with neon lights and jazz, while outside decorated beggars stretched out their hands. It was a bitter carnival, a celebration that seemed to ignore that everything stood upon a cracking ground. The arrival of the Dawes Plan in 1924 brought temporary relief. Investments and American loans stabilized the economy, and for a few years, Germany breathed. It was the so-called Golden Age of Weimar, with cinema, literature, and artistic experimentation that amazed Europe, but that calm was deceptive. It relied on foreign credits, and it was enough for Wall Street to collapse in 1929 for the illusion to vanish. The Great Depression dragged along factories, banks, and jobs. Millions were left without work, hunger struck again, and despair turned into political rage. In that new collapse, extremist voices found fertile ground. Communists and Nazis filled the squares, promising quick solutions, clear culprits, immediate redemption. The former claimed that the future was in Moscow, the latter that Germany must become great again and avenge the affront of Versailles. Meanwhile, the political center sank, unable to sustain the Republic. Elections became a war of slogans and symbols, and in that battle, Hitler's party learned to master propaganda like no one else. Thus were the 1920s for Germany, a decade that swung between chaos and illusion, between misery and excess, between the hope of a modern republic and the poison of revenge. A decade in which the German people became accustomed to living in permanent crisis, to distrusting their currency, their politicians, and their institutions. A decade that unknowingly prepared the ground for an authoritarian voice to promise order, pride, and greatness, and for millions to be ready to follow it. The rise of fascism in Italy and of Nazism in Germany. Germany 1930. The Republic hung by a thread. The Wall Street crash had crossed the Atlantic like lightning on a clear night and had struck the German economy head-on. Closed factories, millions of unemployed, endless lines in charity dining halls. In every neighborhood, men returned home empty-handed, and women hid their tears while serving watery soup to their children. Democracy, which had never been loved, now seemed useless, and in the midst of that collapse, a figure arose like a prophet of salvation, Adolf Hitler. The National Socialist Party, which only a few years earlier had been a group of agitators in Munich taverns, became a mass force. With incendiary speeches, red flags with black swastikas, and marches choreographed with military precision, the Nazis offered something more than politics. They offered spectacle, community, belonging. The rallies seemed like religious ceremonies with Hitler as high priest, shouting with a harsh voice about traitors, Jews, and communists, about the need for a national rebirth. People listened to him, hypnotized, convinced that this man, with his burning gaze and violent gestures, had the answer no one else could give. The elections of 1930 and 1932 confirmed the transformation. The Nazi Party went from being marginal to becoming the second political force in the Reichstag. In every town, an office opened with the swastika on its door. In every school, children repeated chants about the Führer. In every factory, workers found comrades in brown uniforms ready to beat them if they did not conform. Political violence became part of the landscape. In the streets of Berlin and Hamburg, the brown shirts of the SA clashed with the communists in pitched battles, clubs against clubs, knives against knives. Every corner could turn into a battlefield, every tavern into an improvised trench. It was a low-intensity civil war where the Republic bled out, powerless to contain it. President Paul von Hindenburg, an old marshal with a white mustache and Prussian uniform, looked at Hitler with disdain, calling him that Austrian corporal. But political pressure and fear of communism led him in January of 1933 to a gesture that would change history, appointing Hitler as Chancellor. Many believed they could domesticate him, that they would keep him under control, surrounded by conservative ministers. It was a fatal mistake. In a matter of months, Hitler proved that he did not share power. He devoured it. The burning of the Reichstag in February of 1933 was the spark he needed. The parliament went up in flames, and the Nazis immediately blamed the communists. With fear as a weapon, Hitler convinced Hindenburg to sign emergency decrees that suspended rights and freedoms. In March, with the intimidation of the SA in the streets and hallways, the Enabling Act was passed, granting Hitler full powers. The Weimar Republic was dead. In its place was born the Third Reich. The new regime spread rapidly. Parties and unions were banned, prisons filled with opponents, and the terror of the SS began weaving its network of surveillance. The Gestapo lurked in the shadows, listening to conversations, denouncing neighbors, sowing an atmosphere of fear in every neighborhood. At the same time, propaganda directed by Joseph Goebbels flooded the streets with posters, the radios with speeches, and the cinemas with newsreels that portrayed Hitler as an almost supernatural hero. All of Germany became a stage, and the Führer, the undisputed protagonist. But the new power was not only ideology and symbols, it was also steel, gunpowder, and discipline. Secretly at first, then openly, Germany began to rearm. Factories that had once produced civilian machinery now manufactured tanks and planes. Engineers who had worked on disguised projects abroad returned to design submarines and cannons. Conscription returned in 1935, and thousands of young men marched in goose step, convinced that they were forging the new Germany. Rearmament was not only military, it was psychological. The entire country felt that it was standing up again, leaving behind the humiliation of Versailles. That same year, intervention in the Spanish Civil War gave the regime a perfect laboratory for experimentation. The Condor Legion bombed Guernica and tested the tactics that would later be used in the Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe learned to sow terror from the air, while in Germany, the heroism of its pilots was exalted as proof of reborn greatness. Each step reinforced the myth. Hitler seemed invincible. In 1938, he took an even greater leap, the Anschluss. Austria was absorbed by the Reich in a triumphant march that the crowds celebrated, waving flowers and flags. Shortly afterward, his gaze turned to Czechoslovakia. The Sudeten crisis led to the Munich conference, where Chamberlain and Daladier yielded to his demands. Hitler returned to Berlin as a conqueror without war, received among cheers and torches. He had broken once again the chains of Versailles, and the world had allowed him to do so. The euphoria in Germany was total. By the end of the decade, the Third Reich was no longer a promise but a tangible reality. An absolute dictatorship, an expanding army, a nation convinced that its destiny was to dominate Europe. Hatred, revenge, and pride had become fuel. The clock was ticking toward catastrophe, and every speech by Hitler, every parade, every victory without resistance was one more step toward war. In just a few years, Germany had gone from humiliation to delirium, and the coming storm would be more devastating than any other in history. Japanese expansionism and the crisis of the international order. While Europe sank into its crises, far from there in Asia, another storm was beginning to form. Japan, an archipelago that in a few decades had gone from feudalism to industrial power, felt cornered by geography and by the lack of natural resources. Coal, iron, oil, everything a modern power needed to grow had to be sought outside its islands. The First World War had shown its naval strength and regional ambition, but the 1920s reinforced a dilemma. Would Japan be a partner of the international order or the destroyer of that same order? The answer began to take shape in 1931. One night in September, a group of Japanese officers provoked an incident on the railway line near Mukden in Manchuria. It was a crude setup, a minor explosion on the tracks of a train. But the Japanese army used it as an excuse to launch a large-scale invasion. Within weeks, Manchuria was under Japanese control. There, with flags waving and carefully orchestrated ceremonies, they created a puppet state. Manchukuo, governed in appearance by the deposed Chinese Emperor Puyi, in reality dominated by Japanese generals. The message was clear: Japan was not going to wait for anyone's authorization to expand. The League of Nations, that body created to guarantee world peace, condemned the aggression and demanded withdrawal. Tokyo responded with a gesture that foreshadowed the contempt of the European dictators. It left the organization in 1933. The photos of the Japanese delegation standing up and leaving the League's hall in Geneva went around the world. It was the first great visible crack in the building that was supposed to sustain international peace. If the League could not stop Japan, how could it stop Hitler or Mussolini? Meanwhile, in China, the Japanese army advanced with brutality. In 1937, after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the invasion turned into open war. Japanese troops entered Nanking and left behind one of the most atrocious massacres of the century. Tens of thousands of civilians murdered, women raped, houses burned. The world looked on in horror, but no one acted. Neither the United States, isolated in its neutrality, nor weakened Great Britain nor divided France. World peace rested on words, not on actions. Japanese expansionism was not only military. It was presented as the ideology of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a discourse that promised to liberate Asian peoples from Western domination in order, in reality, to replace it with Japanese domination. With each advance, Japan secured new sources of resources and consolidated its position as an imperial power. On the maps of Tokyo, the arc of expansion extended from Korea and Manchuria to China and beyond towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This challenge in Asia resonated in Europe. The failure of the League of Nations to contain Japan was a mirror in which Hitler and Mussolini looked closely. If the Japanese could invade entire territories without suffering more than diplomatic protests, what would prevent Germany from reoccupying the Rhineland or Italy from conquering Ethiopia? The international order was cracking not only because of the actions of one country, but because of the passivity of all the others. Each unpunished aggression was an invitation to the next. The crisis of the international order thus became a theater of shadows. The Western powers spoke of peace while withdrawing into their internal problems. Great Britain struggled with its economic crisis and the challenge of maintaining its empire. France was trapped in political divisions and in the memory of its dead from 1914 to 1918. The United States enclosed itself in isolationism, convinced that the tragedies of Europe and Asia were not its concern. In that vacuum, Japan advanced relentlessly, convinced that destiny had chosen it as the new empire. The 1930s became a succession of failed tests for the international community. Neither economic sanctions, nor league resolutions, nor diplomatic conferences managed to stop Tokyo. And in that global impotence lay the seed of a terrible lesson. The order born in Versailles had no teeth. What had been conceived as a structure of universal peace was revealed as an empty facade. And that facade would soon collapse not only in Asia, but also in the heart of Europe. Japanese expansion and the crisis of the international order were not isolated episodes. They were chapters of the same story. The entire world was learning that treaties could be broken, that institutions could be ignored, and that force prevailed over law. While Japanese troops marched through Peking and Shanghai and Berlin, a dictator was taking note. The war that was being prepared would no longer be local or regional, it would be a planetary conflagration. The hour of defiance, Rhineland, rearmament, and the policy of appeasement. On the 7th of March of 1936, the dawn broke grey over the Rhine basin. The wind still carried the dampness of the fog as columns of German soldiers, barely 19,000 men with 90 pieces of light artillery, crossed the bridges leading to Cologne, Düsseldorf, and other Rhineland cities. They were not enough forces to withstand a serious French counterattack. In fact, the order carried by the Wehrmacht officers was clear and almost desperate. If the French troops responded, they were to retreat without fighting. It was a political gamble much more than a military one. But Hitler's audacity was disguised as firmness, and what could have been a disaster for the Nazi regime turned into its greatest diplomatic triumph up to that point. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a direct challenge to two treaties: the Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited the presence of German troops in that zone, and the Treaty of Locarno, signed in 1925, which guaranteed the neutrality of the western border. Hitler knew he was crossing a dangerous line. The German Chancellor was aware that his army was not yet prepared for open conflict. But he also trusted in the inaction of his adversaries, and he was not wrong. In Paris, the news fell like a bucket of cold water. The French government could immediately mobilize more than 600,000 men against the few German divisions deployed on the Rhine. But the political will was different. France was living through an internal crisis. Weak governments succeeding one another, ideological divisions between right and left, an economy battered by the Great Depression, and above all, a society still bearing on its skin the scars of Verdun and the Somme. The memory of 1,400,000 Frenchmen dead in the Great War paralyzed any impulse to take such a risk again. In London, the reaction was even milder. The Foreign Office interpreted the German action as Germany's return to its own backyard. Stanley Baldwin, British Prime Minister, and Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary, preferred to see the remilitarization as a logical adjustment rather than an unacceptable challenge. Great Britain had its own problems: unemployment, social unrest, the growing threat of Japan in Asia. Hitler had calculated well. Neither France nor Great Britain would lift a finger. The scene in the Rhineland was carefully staged to show the world the image of a resolute Germany. The troops marched with unfurled flags and military bands playing patriotic marches, as if they were going to a parade rather than a high-risk operation. In Cologne, Cardinal Schulte greeted the soldiers as heroes and blessed their return. Nazi propaganda turned the moment into a national epic. The German people freed themselves from the chains of Versailles, regained their honor, and recovered their land. The radio broadcast fiery speeches, newsreels showed cheering crowds, and newspapers spoke of the restoration of German dignity. The importance of the success was incalculable. Hitler, who had staked everything, understood that he had gained more than a territorial move. He had proven that his enemies lacked will. Months later, he would confess, "If the French had entered, we would have withdrawn with our tails between our legs." But they did nothing. That inaction confirmed what the Führer had long suspected, that fear of another war paralyzed the democracies. German rearmament, initiated since 1933, found in the Rhineland its consecration. Until then, the Wehrmacht had grown in the shadows, factories secretly producing weapons, aircraft trained under the guise of sports clubs, tanks disguised as agricultural tractors. But from 1935 onward, Hitler began to display them proudly. The Luftwaffe was presented to the world as a modern and powerful air force, the panzers were paraded dazzling the crowds, and compulsory military service returned German youth to the discipline of arms. Rearmament was not only military, it was psychological and social. Each factory that switched from producing tools to cannons, each worker who exchanged the assembly line for military uniforms, reinforced the idea that Germany was becoming strong again. Goebbels, master of propaganda, turned it into spectacle. In Nuremberg, thousands of torches illuminated the night while endless columns of soldiers swore loyalty. In cinemas, newsreels showed tank maneuvers and bomber flights. Youth grew up convinced that they belonged to a reborn nation. Meanwhile, in London and Paris, the term appeasement began to take hold. It was not a mere strategy, it was almost an obsession. The logic was to avoid war at any cost, even at the cost of tolerating treaty violations. The British and French leaders repeated to themselves again and again that Germany only sought to recover what it had lost, that its demands were understandable, that after Versailles one had to show flexibility. No one wanted to see the obvious. That Hitler would not stop with small victories. The triumph in the Rhineland strengthened the Führer's position within Germany. The generals, who at first looked at him with suspicion, began to acknowledge his boldness. The population, which had supported him enthusiastically since his rise, became convinced that Hitler was a man destined to lead the country to greatness. The critics, inside and outside, were silenced by the evidence of the facts. A reckless move had turned into an absolute victory. The international press, meanwhile, oscillated between condemnation and resignation. Some warned that German rearmament and the violation of Locarno opened the doors to a new war. Others, on the contrary, insisted that Germany was simply restoring its dignity. That debate, that inability to define a clear line against aggression, was the signal Hitler needed. In the Rhineland, it was proven that international treaties were mere scraps of paper without the will to defend them. There was consolidated the idea that the Western democracies lacked determination. There, too, was strengthened in Hitler's mind the conviction that his path was blessed by history. He was, in the eyes of millions of Germans, the man who defied the world and bent it without firing a single shot. German rearmament and the policy of appeasement thus formed a vicious circle. Each Allied concession fed Hitler's confidence. Each German victory reinforced the conviction in London and Paris that it was better not to provoke further conflicts. And at the center of that game, the Reich's war machine grew without pause. Tanks, planes, ships, and entire divisions arose like a torrent, prepared for the next challenge. The Rhineland was not merely an episode of 1936. It was the door that opened the path to Austria, to Czechoslovakia, and finally to Poland. It was the point where the last real chance to stop Hitler without a global war was lost. The day the German soldiers crossed the Rhine and found no resistance, the fate of Europe was sealed. Spain in flames, the laboratory of modern war, July of 1936. Under the burning sun of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain burst into a civil war that would not only be a confrontation between compatriots, but the bloody prelude to what awaited all of Europe. A military coup against the Republic divided the country into two irreconcilable sides: nationals against republicans, tradition against revolution, the old order against the hope of a new world. But it soon became clear that the war in Spain would not be an isolated conflict. It became a board on which foreign powers moved their pieces and tested weapons, tactics, and wills that would soon set the entire continent ablaze. For Hitler and Mussolini, Spain was an opportunity disguised as a crusade. The Führer sent the Luftwaffe under an elegant name, the Condor Legion. Modern airplanes, piloted by young men eager to prove their skill, flew over Iberian skies painted with the swastika. Panzer tanks rolled across fields that until then had known only mules and plows. On the ground, German military advisors taught Franco the art of modern warfare. Mussolini did not lag behind. He sent tens of thousands of Italian soldiers convinced that a nationalist victory would strengthen the fascist cause in Europe. The result was a laboratory for the Blitzkrieg. There, the coordination between armored units, motorized infantry, and aviation was tested. There, systematic bombing of cities was experimented with to sow terror in the civilian rear. The Basque city of Guernica became a symbol of this brutal innovation. On the 26th of April of 1937, German planes dropped bombs and machine-gunned the defenseless population. Entire streets were reduced to rubble, women and children lay among the ruins, and smoke blackened the sky. It was a massacre that shook the world, immortalized by Picasso in his harrowing canvas. But for the Nazi strategists, Guernica was a technical success, proof that the war of the future could be won not only at the front, but by destroying the civil heart of the enemy nation. On the other side, the Spanish Republic received support from the Soviet Union. Stalin sent advisors, T-26 tanks and Polikarpov fighters, but also infiltrated his own political interests, controlling the rear with the iron hand of the NKVD. Thousands of volunteers arrived from all parts of the world to defend the Republican cause in the international brigades. French, British, Latin Americans, even Americans. Men and women who believed they were fighting for freedom soon discovered that Spain was also a field of intrigues, betrayals, and ideological purges. The Spanish Civil War was a mirror of the world to come. In its trenches, songs of hope mixed with summary executions. In its skies, modern aviation roared over medieval villages. In its offices, Western diplomats looked the other way, afraid to get involved. Great Britain and France adopted the policy of non-intervention, a neutrality that in practice favored the rebels, for it left the Republic at the mercy of Soviet aid and isolated from the real support it needed. It was another rehearsal of appeasement, avoiding confrontation at all costs, even if that meant abandoning those who fought against fascism. While the battles destroyed cities such as Madrid, Barcelona, or Teruel, Hitler observed and learned. Each battle, each bombing, each defeat or victory offered him lessons that he would soon apply in Poland and France. The morale of his pilots was tempered in the Iberian fire, and the German war machine adjusted its gears. Spain thus became a training ground disguised as a civil war, a bloody laboratory where Nazism and fascism sharpened the weapons with which they would later set Europe on fire. In 1939, when Franco entered Madrid and proclaimed his victory, the entire world understood that Spain had been more than a national war. It was the prelude to disaster, the first act of the global tragedy. The European peoples had seen the methods of aerial terror, the power of modern weapons, the inaction of the democracies, and the hunger for expansion of the dictatorships. Everything was already on the table. Spain had burned, and in its ashes was drawn the silhouette of the storm that was about to come. The Reich expands. Austria and the fall of Czechoslovakia. Vienna, March of 1938. The cold still mingled with the damp air of the Alps when the streets began to rumble with the footsteps of columns that were not enemies, but were received as brothers. Young Austrians waved flags, women threw flowers from balconies, children ran alongside military trucks. The Wehrmacht entered Austria, and instead of finding resistance, it found a sea of arms raised in Nazi salute. Giant swastikas hung from buildings, waving as if they had been waiting for that moment for years. The Anschluss had begun. Austria, the Führer's homeland, was absorbed by the Third Reich without a single shot being fired, erasing at once the prohibitions of the Treaty of Versailles and the fragile framework of international legality. The movement was not improvised. Hitler had pressured Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg for months. He summoned him to Berchtesgaden, to his Alpine retreat, and intimidated him with veiled threats. Either he accepted Austria's integration into the German orbit, or he would be crushed. Schuschnigg tried to resist by calling a plebiscite, confident that the Austrian people would vote to maintain independence. But Hitler moved faster. He ordered his local Nazi agents to mobilize, provoke unrest, and demand union with the German homeland. The Austrian Chancellor, isolated and without foreign support, resigned. In a matter of hours, power fell into the hands of Arthur Seyss-Inquart, an avowed Nazi who immediately requested German intervention. The entry of the Wehrmacht on the 12th of March was more a triumphal procession than a military operation. Hitler crossed the border and was received in Linz, his youthful city, by delirious crowds. The emotion was palpable. The man who had lived as a failed artist in Vienna, rejected by the Academy, returned as an absolute conqueror. In the streets of Vienna, tens of thousands crowded into the Heldenplatz, the Plaza of Heroes, to hear the Führer proclaim the union of Austria with Germany. The crowd roared as one. The Austrian Republic ceased to exist. The Anschluss was complete. Not everyone shared the enthusiasm, although Nazi propaganda made sure to silence dissent. Opponents were immediately persecuted. Austrian Jews were humiliated in the streets, forced to scrub sidewalks with brushes while crowds insulted them. However, the image that circulated through Europe was that of a nation surrendering with open arms to the Reich. In a matter of days, Austria was absorbed. Its institutions, its army, its economy all came under German control. Europe reacted with verbal protests, but nothing more. France, mired in political crises and with a people unwilling to face another war, limited itself to condemnation. Great Britain, under the leadership of Neville Chamberlain, accepted the annexation as a fait accompli. The argument was that Austria and Germany shared language, culture, and history, and that the union was natural. No one dared to risk a military confrontation. Hitler learned the most dangerous lesson of his career. Treaties could be broken, commitments ignored, as long as one had the audacity to defy the world. With Austria already in his power, Hitler turned his gaze toward Czechoslovakia, a young state created after the First World War. It was an industrialized country, with a vibrant democracy and a well-prepared army, protected as well by a system of modern fortifications. But on its western border lay the Sudetenland, inhabited by more than 3 million German speakers. There Hitler found his pretext. He proclaimed that those Germans were victims of discrimination and that Germany had the duty to protect them. In reality, the objective was much more ambitious: to dismantle Czechoslovakia and seize its industry, especially the Skoda armament factories, which would be essential for the future war. The propaganda campaign was fierce. The Nazis financed the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein, which organized demonstrations and riots demanding annexation to Germany. Meanwhile, Hitler delivered increasingly fiery speeches about the right of self-determination of Germans in Czechoslovakia. Europe, once again, was dragged into a crisis. The tension reached its peak in September of 1938. France, allied with Czechoslovakia, was bound to support it in the event of an attack. Great Britain, fearing a general conflict, intervened to seek a diplomatic solution. Thus was convened the Munich Conference. It was the setting for one of the greatest diplomatic betrayals of the 20th century. At the table sat Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and Daladier. The Czech president, Edvard Beneš, was not invited. His country stood in the dock without a voice in the proceedings. After long negotiations, the Western leaders gave in. The Sudetenland would be handed over to Germany. Chamberlain, convinced he had saved peace, returned to London waving a paper bearing Hitler's signature and proclaimed before a hopeful crowd, "I have brought peace for our time." The cheers were the echo of a people's desperation not to face another slaughter. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated another victory without firing a shot. German troops entered the Sudetenland and seized the Czech fortifications. Czechoslovakia, deprived of its natural defenses, was left helpless. The armament industry fell into the hands of the Reich. The world believed it had bought peace, but in reality it had sold its credibility. The illusion shattered a few months later. On the 15th of March of 1939, German tanks entered Prague. There were no longer pretexts of German minorities or promises of self-determination. It was a direct occupation. The Czechoslovak state was dismembered. Slovakia became a puppet state under the clerical fascist Josef Tiso, and Bohemia and Moravia were proclaimed a protectorate of the Reich. For the first time, Hitler openly showed that it was not about uniting German peoples, but about conquering and dominating. The impact on Europe was devastating. London and Paris understood that appeasement had failed. Chamberlain, who months earlier had been hailed as a savior, was now criticized as naive. France, trapped in its internal divisions, also acknowledged that it had lost precious time. From that moment, the promises of support to Poland began to take concrete form. If Hitler dared to go further, there would be war. For the Führer, the message was different. He had managed to annex Austria, dismantle Czechoslovakia, and expand the Reich without suffering real military opposition. He believed that destiny was on his side. His confidence in Western inaction became absolute. The German war machine was ready, and the next target was Poland. Austria celebrated its union, Czechoslovakia lay dismembered, and Europe walked like a sleepwalker toward the abyss. The clock of war could no longer be stopped. In less than a year, the fire would break loose. The German-Soviet Pact, August 1939, August of 1939. In the corridors of the Kremlin, the chandeliers illuminated a spectacle that seemed taken from a political nightmare. Diplomats of the Third Reich and of the Soviet Union, irreconcilable ideological enemies, shook hands like old comrades. At the center of the scene, smiling and satisfied, stood Vyacheslav Molotov, Soviet Chancellor. At his side, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, signed with a firm stroke a document that would change the fate of the continent. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. For years, Hitler had spewed speeches about the need to destroy Bolshevism, about the existential threat of Moscow to the Aryan race. Stalin, for his part, had denounced Nazism as a brutal enemy of the proletariat. But in that summer, pragmatism prevailed over hatred. Hitler needed to secure his eastern rear in order to strike at Poland without fear of a war on two fronts. Stalin, distrustful of the West, preferred to gain time, strengthen his army after the purges that had weakened it, and in passing expand his influence toward Eastern Europe. The pact, announced to the world on the 23rd of August, included a secret protocol that sealed the complicity. In that annex, Moscow and Berlin divided the map as if it were a chessboard. Poland would be split in two, the Baltic states would fall under the Soviet orbit, Finland would remain in its sphere, and Germany would have free hands to invade without opposition from the east. It was a cold, calculated, brutal agreement. Two dictators turned entire nations into bargaining pieces. The news struck Europe like lightning. In London and Paris, incredulity mingled with panic. For months, the British and the French had tried to negotiate an alliance with Stalin to contain Hitler, but their delegations had arrived late, without clear commitments, showing the indecision that had marked all their previous actions. Stalin, distrustful, chose the agreement with Berlin, which offered him much more and immediately. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated his greatest diplomatic triumph. Until then, many of his generals had feared that the invasion of Poland would unleash an impossible war against the two great powers of the continent. The pact with Stalin dispelled those doubts. "I have found my partner," the Führer exclaimed with pride. It did not matter that this partner was the communist dictator he had sworn to destroy. What mattered was that now he had free hands. In Moscow, Stalin toasted with Ribbentrop under the portrait of Lenin. He looked pleased, convinced that he had deceived Hitler, that he would be the one to reap the benefits. In official speeches, Soviet propaganda changed overnight. Germany ceased to be a fascist monster and became a state with which we can live in peace. Communists throughout the world, confused, received the order to support the new line. It was a turn as brutal as the pact itself. The signing in Moscow was the final countdown toward war. German troops were already concentrated on the Polish border, ready to launch themselves toward Warsaw. Soviet soldiers awaited their turn to advance from the east. Poland, trapped between two giants, was doomed, and all of Europe understood that the time of concessions had ended. The impossible pact between Hitler and Stalin not only sealed Poland's fate, it announced the beginning of the greatest conflict in history. The bewilderment in the rest of the world was immediate. The communist parties of Europe, obedient to Moscow, went in a matter of days from denouncing fascism as the greatest threat to calling the coming war an imperialist quarrel between powers. In Germany, Nazi propaganda, which had portrayed Bolshevism as a mortal enemy, fell suddenly silent, justifying the alliance as a pragmatic agreement. What no one yet knew was that that pact was not an end, but merely a prologue, a cynical truce that sooner or later would be broken in an even more brutal war between both regimes. The invasion of Poland, 1st of September of 1939. The dawn of the 1st of September of 1939 was not just another morning in the history of Europe. The sky over Poland was still dark when, at 4:45 in the morning, a metallic roar broke the silence. The cannons of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein began to bombard the Polish garrison at Westerplatte in the free city of Danzig. It was the opening shot of the most devastating war humanity had ever known. As shells fell on Polish positions, columns of the Wehrmacht crossed the borders, and in the air, the Stukas of the Luftwaffe descended with their deafening sirens, spreading panic among soldiers and civilians. The invasion had begun, and with it the Second World War. Hitler's meticulously prepared plans were named Fall Weiss, Case White. The objective was clear: to destroy Poland within weeks through a coordinated attack from the north, south and west. The German forces numbered more than 1,500,000 men, backed by 2,500 tanks and almost 2,000 aircraft. Opposite them, the Polish army was brave but poorly equipped. It barely possessed a little more than 400 aircraft, many of them obsolete, and its cavalry, the romantic symbol of the nation, could not compete against the armoured machinery advancing at full speed. The key to the offensive was the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Germany had learned in Spain, had practiced in secret for years, and now applied the strategy with unprecedented brutality. The panzers burst into Polish territory swiftly, opening corridors that the motorized infantry immediately exploited. Above them, the Stukas dove at almost vertical angles, dropping bombs with surgical precision and demoralizing defenders with their sinister wailing. It was not only about defeating the enemy army, it was about collapsing its will, breaking the spirit of resistance from the very first day. The first clash also had symbolic value. At Westerplatte, barely 200 Polish soldiers resisted for 7 days against a vastly superior enemy. Isolated and without support, they responded to the fire of the Schleswig-Holstein and to the assaults of German infantry with tenacity that even surprised their attackers. They finally surrendered, but their resistance became a myth of heroism. It was the prelude to a far greater drama, an entire country fighting with courage against an unstoppable storm. Meanwhile, in the air, the Luftwaffe swept the Polish skies. Within the first 48 hours, much of Poland's air force was destroyed on the ground, caught by surprise at its bases. Columns of refugees, entire families fleeing eastward, became targets for strafing. Roads crowded with carts, bicycles and horses were devastated by bombings. It was a modern war unleashed upon a nation still living with 19th century structures. The Polish cavalry, a symbol of national pride, faced the cruel reality of modern warfare. Although there were never suicidal charges against tanks, as Nazi propaganda later claimed, there were indeed confrontations where horsemen armed with sabres encountered motorized columns standing at a clear disadvantage. The image of lancers facing armor became a metaphor for the clash between tradition and technology, between courage and mechanical brutality. The Polish government expected its allies, France and Great Britain, to fulfill their commitments. And indeed, on the 3rd of September, 2 days after the invasion, both countries declared war on Germany. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced by radio the definitive rupture: "This country is at war with Germany." It was a solemn yet ambiguous moment, because although war was declared, neither France nor Great Britain launched any significant offensive to relieve the pressure on Poland. The so-called phony war, Sitzkrieg, began on the Western Front, while in the east, Poland bled alone. The following days were a succession of catastrophes for the Polish defenders. German troops advanced relentlessly toward Warsaw. On the 9th of September, the panzers reached the outskirts of the capital. The city, however, did not surrender immediately. For weeks, civilians joined soldiers in desperate defense. Trenches were dug in the streets, barricades improvised with trams and furniture, and German artillery bombarded without rest. Each neighborhood became a battlefield, while refugees crowded into basements and subway stations. Warsaw resisted until the 27th of September, when finally, surrounded and destroyed, it was forced to capitulate. But the final stab came from the east. On the 17th of September, in accordance with the secret protocol of the German-Soviet Pact, the Red Army crossed the eastern border. More than 500,000 Soviet soldiers invaded Poland, presenting themselves as liberators of Belarus and Ukraine, but in reality fulfilling their part of the agreement with Hitler. Poland, trapped between two giants, was doomed. The government fled to Romania, and the remnants of the army were annihilated or captured. By the end of September, the country had ceased to exist as an independent state. The brutality of the occupation manifested itself from the very beginning. The Nazis began summary executions, deportations, and systematic persecution of Jews, intellectuals, and officers. In the east, the Soviets did the same. Thousands of Polish officers were arrested, many of whom would end up in the Katyn graves in 1940. The country became the stage of double repression, a laboratory for what would become the atrocities of total war. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated. The plan had worked perfectly. Poland had been destroyed in less than 6 weeks. His generals, who had doubted him, were now convinced of the Führer's genius. The German people, intoxicated by victory, saw him as an infallible leader. But in the halls of power, some warned that something had changed. France and Great Britain had declared war, and although they had not acted immediately, there was no turning back. Germany had not only conquered a country, it had ignited the flame of a global conflict. In London and Paris, the feeling was ambivalent. They had kept their word, but their passivity in the face of Poland's tragedy left deep scars. The Poles would never forget the solitude of September of 1939. For many, it was confirmation that the Western powers lacked the real will to confront Nazism. And for Hitler, it was the sign that he could still gain time before the Western Front truly came alive. The invasion of Poland was not only the beginning of the war, it was also a mirror of the future. There, for the first time, were seen the tactics of the blitzkrieg, the brutal coordination between air and ground, the use of terror against civilians as a deliberate strategy, and the complicity between two seemingly irreconcilable dictatorships. It was the bloody prologue to a conflict that would last 6 years and transform the entire world. The 1st of September of 1939 marked the dawn of cataclysm. A country was wiped from the map, millions of lives were trapped under the invaders' boots, and the entire planet plunged into the greatest tragedy of its history. The bells of Warsaw, silenced by bombs, announced not only the fall of Poland, but the beginning of a dark era in which humanity would learn how far destruction can go when hatred and ambition rule. The declaration of war by Great Britain and France, 3rd of September of 1939. On the 3rd of September of 1939, barely 2 days after the German invasion of Poland, the clocks marked the hour of definitive rupture. At 11:15 in the morning, Neville Chamberlain spoke to the British nation by radio. His voice, solemn and grave, resonated in the homes of millions of listeners. "This country is at war with Germany." It was the phrase no one wanted to hear, but that many knew was inevitable. In Paris, a few hours later, Prime Minister Édouard Daladier announced the same. France and Great Britain were fulfilling their guarantees to Poland. They had declared war. In Berlin, the news did not surprise Hitler. He expected it. Nevertheless, in his inner circles, there was a moment of tension. The German strategy relied on repeating the success of 1914, defeating one enemy first, then the other. But unlike the Great War, now Germany had deliberately provoked a war on 2 fronts. Even so, the Führer smiled confidently. He was convinced that his Western enemies would not act decisively, and soon it would be proven that he was right. In the streets of London and Paris, the reaction was ambivalent. There was indignation over the attack on Poland, but also a heavy silence, like that of resignation. The memories of 1914 to 1918 were too fresh. No one forgot the trenches, the fields of Flanders, the millions of dead. The veterans who still walked the streets with canes and scars were a living reminder of what could come. Thus, the people received the news with a mix of sadness, fear, and a sense of fatality. It was the beginning of something that was sensed to be long and terrible. The declaration of war, however, did not translate into an immediate outbreak on the Western Front. In fact, what followed was a strange, bewildering stage that the Germans called Sitzkrieg, sitting war, and the French drôle de guerre, phony war. For 8 months, until May of 1940, most of the Western Front remained motionless, as if the powers had declared war but had forgotten to fight it. The armies were deployed, the cannons prepared, but there were no significant offensives. The French mobilized more than 2 million men and occupied the imposing Maginot Line, that chain of underground fortifications stretching along the border with Germany. There, soldiers lived as if in cities underground: dining rooms, dormitories, cinemas, even wine cellars. Everything was ready to resist, but not to attack. The French strategy was defensive to the extreme: wait for the German movement and withstand it. The British, for their part, sent to France the British Expeditionary Force under the command of Lord Gort. There were about 160,000 men initially, well-trained but insufficient for a large-scale offensive. They were deployed alongside the French in the north, ready to coordinate in case of attack. Meanwhile, the Germans, after destroying Poland, moved their forces westward, preparing what would be the masterstroke of 1940. The contrast was unsettling. While in the east Poland was being devoured by Germany and the Soviet Union, with cities bombed and armies crushed, in the west reigned a strange silence. The French troops timidly ventured into the so-called Saar offensive in mid-September of 1939, but it was a limited, almost symbolic advance that soon withdrew without fighting. The Allied soldiers, entrenched, spent their days in inactivity, playing cards, writing letters to their families, or exchanging cigarettes with French peasants. It was a war without war, a tense pause, as if the world were holding its breath. The Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force carried out some limited bombings, but even these were timid. At the beginning, the British dropped leaflets instead of bombs, with messages meant to demoralize the German population. The British press called them confetti raids. Only later did serious attacks begin against naval and industrial targets. For now, the conflict seemed suspended in a limbo. The British Royal Navy, on the other hand, did go into action from the first day. The naval blockade against Germany was imposed immediately, replicating the strategy of the First World War. In the Atlantic seas, German submarines were already beginning to sink Allied merchant ships, while convoys were organized to transport vital supplies from the United States and the colonies. The sea became the first great active battlefield, anticipating the long and bloody Battle of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the civilian population prepared for the worst. In London, air raid sirens sounded every night, even when there were no bombings. Air raid shelters were built, gas masks were distributed, and families practiced emergency drills. Children were evacuated from the big cities to the countryside in a massive operation that left train stations full of little ones with tags hanging from their necks and miniature suitcases. People slept dressed, ready to run to the shelter at any moment. Although the bombs had not yet fallen, fear was already installed. In France, the situation was similar. Millions of civilians had fled the regions near the German border, creating a wave of internal refugees. The streets of Paris were filled with rumors, cafes crowded with political discussions, and newspapers that spoke of the imminence of air attacks. But the skies remained calm. The strange stillness became unbearable, like the silence before a storm. For Hitler, those months were of preparation and calculation. After the victory in Poland, he sought to negotiate peace with the Western powers, hoping they would accept the new map of Europe. His bet was that France and Great Britain, weakened by the First World War, would prefer to close their eyes once more. But this time, the calculation failed. The memory of Munich and the betrayal in Czechoslovakia still burned. London and Paris could no longer back down without losing everything. The fate was sealed. The war could not be avoided. In Moscow, Stalin took advantage of the pact with Hitler to expand his influence. In September, he had taken half of Poland, and in the following months invaded Finland in the so-called Winter War, in addition to imposing treaties on the Baltic states. The map of Eastern Europe was rapidly transforming under the shadow of the German-Soviet pact. It was a brutal reminder that this war would not be only Germany against the West, but a conflict of multiple fronts, ideologies, and ambitions. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was cold and silent on the Western Front. French and British soldiers, bored and anxious, dubbed the stage La Drôle de Guerre. They wrote diaries describing long watches without shots, tasteless meals in damp trenches, endless card games. Some even exchanged messages with German soldiers on the other side who lived a similar situation, waiting for orders that never came. It seemed a war on pause, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time, and in May of 1940, time ran out. German tanks crossed the Ardennes, terrain the French generals considered impassable, and unleashed the offensive that would crush France in a matter of weeks. The phony war became a real nightmare, and all of Europe was plunged into a whirlwind from which it would not emerge until 1945. With the invasion of Poland and the entry into war of France and Great Britain, the conflict was no longer local. It had become a European war, and soon it would be global. The seas filled with convoys attacked by submarines, the skies became routes for bombers, and every continent would be dragged into the cataclysm. What had begun with a cannon shot in Westerplatte now spread like a fire, devouring borders, armies, and entire peoples. The silence of those months was deceptive, like the still air before a hurricane. No one knew it then, but the calm that covered Europe hid the gears of a war machine already in motion. Behind the quiet fronts, factories worked without rest, armies trained, plans were refined over maps spread on general staff tables. The apparent inaction was only the prelude to a devastating blow. Very soon, in May of 1940, the German armoured divisions would burst forth with fury, and the war would cease to be a promise to become an implacable reality. The strange calm of the phony war was merely the prelude to a storm that would sweep away everything in its path. And in that tense pause, while soldiers played cards and civilians waited in shelters that were never used, the entire world walked to sleep toward the greatest catastrophe in its history.